Hi, everybody. It's Craig. Welcome to Cutting the Crap with Shap. Thank you so much for checking out my podcast. I really do appreciate that. If you get a chance, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. We're on Spotify. We have amazing guests like our one tonight, Jennifer Klein. She is an author, educator, leader, somebody who is going to share some amazing information. I was looking up some of the stuff that she had talked to me about, and I really think the conversation is going to be fabulous. She's going to open your eyes. There's going to be some interesting dialogue that Jennifer and I have back and forth. So I really hope that you get something out of the time that we spent together. Again, thank you so much for subscribing and being here. Jennifer, how are you doing?
Doing well, thank you. Connecting from snowy and rather cold Colorado today.
Okay, there you go. Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, I think one of the most important things to mention about myself actually is that I'm a product of alternative experiential education myself. And I'm not going to give my exact age, but I will say that this is early in the movement of alternative education. I graduated from an alternative public school here in Colorado called the Open Living School at the time. Now it's Open School. And I was there from 10 to 18. I think it really shaped my thinking in a lot of really powerful ways because what we were doing was similar to experiential PBL or expeditionary PBL or something along those lines, right? Project based, very
Mm-hmm.
student centered. What was the school was actually defined as part of the democratic school movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we were involved as students in all aspects of running the show, and I think that's really colored everything that I did after that. I got my degrees in creative writing and literature with the intention of being a writer with a focus on fiction for a very long time. But when I discovered education, and this is the story that I tell in Barbara Bray's new book, Grow Your Why,
Yep.
when I discovered education was when I found this intersection between what it meant to impact the world through the classroom and my writing. And so I started teaching. I guess I was in the classroom for a total of 19 years, mostly high school English. I taught in Latin America and Central America. I taught in the United States in the Denver area. University level writing teacher as well, high school English, all that kind of stuff. And I left the classroom in 2010 because I believed that professional learning could be done better than it was being done. I wanted it to be dynamic. I wanted teachers to experience what we were hoping learners would experience, as opposed to my standing at the front and lecturing them about why lecturing is a bad thing to do, right? And then after about 7 years as a consultant, working with a variety of different organizations, I published my first book, which was the Global Education Guidebook, all about building global partnerships. 2017, I was invited to become a head of school in an international independent school just north of Bogota in Colombia, where I was able to turn the ship in some pretty significant ways, but in a context that was pretty traditional.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, I came back to Denver, wrote my second book with Capono Siati, which is the landscape model of learning. And since then, I've basically just been consulting and writing with this dream of, the writing part of my life being the way that I make my living. Someday, maybe. We'll see how that goes.
Okay. Hey, listen, I'm a writer as well, and it's definitely an eye-opening experience, but also incredibly gratifying.
Yes.
Putting your words down on paper for people to read. I always tell either people that are thinking about being authors or fellow authors that you have nothing to lose. Um, you put your words down for people to see, and those who want to embrace it will, and those who don't won't, and either way is okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
at least my view on it.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you completely. It is interesting though too, isn't it, Craig? Because my father's a cellist, or was in the course of his career. He can't play anymore, but when he goes and performs in front of an audience, it's very vulnerable, it's very raw and real,
Mhm.
and he gets immediate feedback. The same thing with a painter. As long as they go to their own opening, right? They're gonna get that chance to see how people respond to their work. I think the most challenging thing about writing, which is something I didn't foresee when I was a young person getting excited about this field, is that you don't have that immediate feedback. And the feedback trickles in slowly, and you never
Mhm,
quite know whether this thing that you birthed is going to have the impact that you wanted it to,
mhm.
right? So I think that's probably the hardest part about it for me, that and making a living, obviously.
Yeah, and I think, from the writing standpoint, I always tell students, that if somebody would have told me when I first started teaching I'd be writing a book, I would have laughed at them because I never liked writing.
Mhm.
Like, I was an athlete in high school.
Right.
Um, so that was something that I never really thought about. And then at some point, throughout my career, without going into the crazy details, it was just something that happened over time. And a lot of it comes down to, and this is something that I know you have it, it's our passion for trying to help students
Yes.
at
Absolutely.
the core of it all. If you're writing a book about education, even if it's not necessarily student centered, it could be more leadership based.
Mhm.
At the end of it all is really about helping students,
Mhm.
because that is what we are paid to do. And I say that all the time, whether you're writing a book about leadership or professional learning or about teaching, it is always about students first.
Yes.
That kind of comes back to, you kind of mentioned you want schools to be a place where students can thrive and feel success, and I guess be appreciated for their talents. And being honest with you, I feel exactly the same way.
Mhm.
But as we talk tonight, one of the questions that I'm going to ask you frequently is, okay, yeah, that sounds great. Like, who wouldn't want that? If you said to a parent, hey, guess what? Your student's going to be in school where they get appreciated for all their amazing talents. Well, nobody'd say they don't want that.
Right.
But how do we do it, I guess, is the question.
Right. Well, it's a big question too, right?
Mhm,
I think there are a lot of layers to it. The first thing that I would say is that I sense, and I don't want to sound like I'm teacher blaming at all, because I've been in the classroom myself, and I don't believe that teachers are at fault for the systems that they work inside. But
mhm.
I think that we often focus more of our energy and attention on the deficits than on the assets. Now that makes perfect sense because our role is to teach, right? Our role is to help them get better at things that they're not as good at. And I'm certainly not saying that that's something we should avoid. Obviously, it's the intention of education, right? To lift every child and help them become better at the things that they struggle with. But when a child feels seen for only their deficits, for only the things that they're not good at, when they start to feel like everything they're doing could be done better, I don't think that's motivating, right? I really don't think that that helps the young person say, okay, I can do it, right? They just feel kind of seen for what they're struggling with, right? So in the landscape model of learning, Capono Ciati and I wrote about this model that we came up with. But it's not all that unusual or new, though. I think we really were reflecting on things that have been good practice in student-centered learning for a long time. But we came up with this framework of three elements. The first being the ecosystem, which is all about ways that we can learn as much as possible about the young people we're working with,
Mhm.
not in an invasive or like, destroy your privacy kind of way, right? But
Right.
in a very authentic, lots of strategies and suggested activities. We made sure that the book was really practical. What are the ways that we can get to know our students and find their assets and understand, for example, that a student from one culture might have one set of assets and a student from another might have a different set of assets, that we don't see a student who struggles cognitively as a student who's mostly about deficits, but that we really try to eke out who they are so that we can treat them as a whole human being in the course of their learning process. The second element is the horizon. And the horizon is all about goal setting and understanding what that next step should be. But basing that too, as much as possible, on who the child is and who they hope to be, right? And that includes the aspirations of their families and their communities and the things that they dream of being able to do with their lives, right? But it also includes thinking about how we might need to adjust our standards or our expectations based on who they are so that we can celebrate success, recognizing that success might actually look a little different for every kid, right? That myth of standardization is really tricky. And finally, the pathway. The last element is the pathway. And that's all about the use of pedagogies like project-based learning, where we could be working toward the same goals within the classroom, but do so on different pathways so that the learning feels meaningful and relevant and really leverages those assets that we found in each child. So that's kind of a simplified way of offering you the model. But in the book, we really tried to make it as practical as possible, right? So each section, each of those elements has lots and lots of strategies, activities we can do with kids that will help us understand who they are, what their aspirations and strengths are, and how to get there, how to get them there.
I love, first of all, everything you said. I will tell you that I buy in completely. There is nothing you said that I would disagree with. Actually, there is one thing. Um, I want to preface this by saying I'm going to follow up with say I don't blame teachers,
Mm-mm.
but I will say this is some of the things you talked about, creating a certain environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, who does that? The teacher does that.
Right.
Okay, so that is
Right.
about the teacher. The teacher's
Right.
creating that environment. Okay, you're
Yeah.
talking about project-based learning and giving kids multiple opportunities. The teacher does that.
Absolutely.
So, um, my thing that I will say is, ultimately, it is the teacher's responsibility to create a space where kids feel successful. Your
Absolutely.
initial comment about deficits, I think, is something that I've done a lot of professional learning with teachers. And one of my comments to them is I want you to think about if your son or daughter, if you had one, was in your class. And we've all heard this before, right? This is not anything new and
Mm-hmm.
earth shattering, but take a second and think about it. Your son or daughter is in your class and they don't feel like they have a voice. They don't feel respected for their talents. They don't feel like they can take risks.
Right.
Would you want them to be in that class?
Right.
Of course not. Of course you wouldn't want that.
Yep.
And part of that is we could go on honestly for hours and hours and hours about issues of teacher professional learning
Mm-hmm.
because that is a whole different thing. I'm sure we could touch on it, but that's a very vast topic. Today, I had my first day with new students. So, for those of you who don't know, I am a high school health and physical education teacher. I've been one for 36 years. Um, I think I have amazing relationships with many, many students. On our first day today, I sat all of these high school kids down in a circle with me and said, I want you to tell me something about you that you're proud of. How difficult is that? It's incredibly easy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Right.
now, when I say incredibly easy, if the people that are watching, I hope you try it because you're going to be amazed. Not with little kids. Little kids will hands up or flying up in the air. But
Mm-hmm.
as you get to middle school and high school, if you ask kids something they struggle with, their hands will fly up in a second because that is learned behaviors. They've learned to be able to say, oh, I'm not good at this. I'm not good at that. Ask them something they're proud of. Here's what it looks like. Um, uh, uh, they don't know,
Yeah.
or they're afraid to say something. Now, I will say today, looking at my class, the first time, so we'll do a quick thing. Jennifer, tell me something about you that you're proud of.
I'm proud every time my writing has an impact on an educator.
And I would say, oh, Jennifer, I love that. That's great. So the second Jennifer said that, I came back with, that's awesome. So now picture the person, student sitting next to Jennifer. The first thing they're thinking is, wow, Shap gave her a compliment.
Mhm.
And this goes back to kind of, without going too long-winded, this is kind of SEL stuff all wrapped into all of this
Of course.
information here. Even though I
Yep.
was doing SEL way before it was called SEL. When you think about this, a classroom where students feel safe, they're going to be willing to take risks. A
Absolutely.
classroom where students have a voice, they're going to be willing to share their opinions. A classroom where, and everybody talks about, I'm so sick of hearing student centered. If I hear
Mm.
student centered one freaking more time, I'm going to go out of my freaking mind. Student centered. Well, of course the class should be student centered. It shouldn't be teacher centered.
Right.
But what does student centered mean? Like, and you can touch on that, but when people hear that, educators hear that, here is the pushback I've gotten hundreds of times. I do mean hundreds. Shap, you don't understand. I got to cover all this content. We got to get all this content. Now, to be fair, that's the system.
Yep. Right.
That's the system. I mean, and what I will normally say back to them is, I got you. I understand. But you can't tell me that you can't take 5 minutes to do something to get to know your students. That was kind of one of the things you talked about.
Right.
5 minutes. I'm not talking about taking 90 minutes of a class. 5 minutes to get to know your kids, you know?
Right.
Um, but again, I think the stuff that you're saying makes sense. I just think it's a little bit more difficult than just saying it.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And I appreciate the distinction too. I mean, I was trying to make that distinction in my answer between the teacher and the system that they're working under. Right. And so I agree with you completely. Right. Teachers can choose to let go of a little control, to worry a little less about the standards, although the system makes that hard. Right. But they can choose to teach a little bit differently. They just have to be inspired to do that. And what I've been finding is it doesn't matter what the age of the teacher is, doesn't
Yep.
matter what their background is, doesn't matter how they were educated themselves. When they start to feel like it's possible, when they start to feel like they're equipped with the skills to do it, they're going to do it. Right. And it's less about time and money and, oh, I just can't because, right. That's why I say I don't blame teachers. I agree with you completely that the culture of the classroom is defined first and foremost by the teacher. I think the best teachers, and I'll go ahead and use that student-centered phrase, right? But I think the best student-centered teachers walk into the classroom and rather than saying, you are now in my domain and here are the rules, they say, all right, so we're going to build community in here. What are the agreements that you all think we need to be
Yes.
an effective classroom? And to really support
Wow.
everyone and make sure everyone in here thrives and feels successful and struggles through things that are hard, but they know that they can take those risks
Mm.
and grow and learn. That puts it on the kids, right? That's a teacher who knows how to say, okay, I may be in charge of this space, but it's their education, right? So what do I need to do to create those conditions for growth? Right. So that's what I'm talking about. I agree with you. It's in the teacher's hands. I just think that we spend a lot of time when you think on a systemic or political level, and I've seen this in lots of different countries, there's a lack of trust in educators as well. And that's kind of what I mean by teacher blaming. Like we have to insist on all these tests to believe that the teacher has done right and well, right? And I guess I just worry about that. I agree with accountability, right? I want to make sure the kids are really learning. But I think in a lot of ways, we've tied teachers' hands and we've made it really hard for them to be successful at things that are more authentic. And maybe we've just built in some really awful habits too out of necessity, right? I'll give you another example. Discipline is a word that I hate. It's a word I absolutely
Oh,
hate, right?
yes.
Because it suggests that the teacher has to discipline the child on some level. And what I've noticed is that when teachers build agreements and step back and I'm even going to use a language of power and say they allow or let their kiddos really think for themselves and manage the classroom. I mean, I've seen kindergartners manage the classroom with obviously with the support of the teacher. But what I found is that the more we step back, the more students step up, right? So there's a weird little paradox in there, right, Craig, that on a certain level we think that controlling fiercely will lead to better outcomes, and the reality is that less control and more questioning and more involving them in their own choice and voice and protagonism, that's actually what gives you the opportunity to have a thriving classroom where things work.
Well, here's a great way to kind of frame that. And of course, again, Jennifer, you're spot on, and I agree with you 100%. If you think about professional learning, right? And you said this, it's something we talked about. So you go in professional learning. So think about all the educators that are watching this, that are going to watch it. Here's a great thought. Let's do something. You are going to this professional learning with Shap and Jennifer, and you're really excited. I know most of you aren't, but let's say you are.
Let's just take a leap. Yeah.
So now you come to the professional learning, and Jennifer and Shap, we give you all these guidelines that we're going to do. And you sit there and you listen for an hour.
Mm-hmm.
Now, no engagement, no choice,
Yeah.
and people, you walk out of there saying, "Oh my God, that was so horrible."
Mm-hmm.
Well, think about your classroom again, okay? And this is just something I say to students when they first come in. And again, I'm teaching high school, so the kids are older. Everybody, how you doing today? And a good Shap. I'm like, let me ask you a question. Whose class is this? And they'll be like, what? I'm like, I'm sorry. Whose class is this? They're like, Shap, it's your class. I'm like, really? They're like, yeah, you're the teacher. I said, yeah, but there's 26 of you. If there's 26 of you and one of me, how can it be my class? There's 26 of you. And they're like, look at me. And I'm like, no, it's our class. And I do an activity called, I'm trying to remember the exact name. It's something like, what does a successful class look like? And we go around the room and we say to students, tell me what a successful student in class looks like. And kids will say, good listener, organized, doesn't procrastinate, respectful. And we'll make a list of these guidelines. First of all, I hate the term rules because they're not rules.
Yeah.
They're guidelines.
Totally agree.
They're not rules. And I'll say, okay, buddy, hey, nice job. There's the guidelines for our class.
Yeah.
Can you do them?
Yeah.
And again, you're talking about something, though, that, and this is, I think, a really powerful message that you said, but is so difficult. It's so difficult when it comes to giving up power and control. The first time you do it, you don't always get exactly what you think. And what will happen with many, many teachers that I've observed is giving kids a certain amount of freedom can be very scary.
Yes.
Because you don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And if it doesn't play out the way you, I guess, thought it would, the easiest
wanted
path.
it to.
Yeah, the easiest path is what? Go back to what you were doing.
Right. Right.
Because we're comfortable. And that's the same thing. It's going to tie into like our next thing. Unless you are incredibly confident as an educator, like myself, I have 36 years of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I have it all figured out, but I have a lot of it figured out.
Right.
Not all of it, but a lot of it, which would seem to make sense because I've been doing it for 36 years. You would hope that after 36 years, you'd have a decent amount of it figured out. What I see in many instances is kids are compliant.
Mm-hmm.
When you're at I don't know how to phrase this. I'll just say the school that I teach at, for the most part, many of the kids are compliant. Mm-hmm. You ask them to sit quietly, they'll sit quietly. You ask them to do the work, they'll do the work. And I'm not saying that's always bad. I'm really not. I'm not saying that's always bad. Sometimes there does have to be some compliance. Like if you're taking a test, there needs
Mhm.
to be a certain amount of compliance involved in that. But I will follow up and say, when you're solely about compliance, you get students who don't take risks. You get students who are uncomfortable sharing their voice.
Mhm.
And when you do ask them to come out of their comfort zone, they've been trained not to because they've just been compliant.
Absolutely.
And those are systemic. You used the term systemic before, which I think is an excellent term. I can talk to you and already know what kind of educator you are.
Mhm.
It's just
Yeah.
obvious. And you can tell what kind of educator I am because it's obvious. But in
Right.
many instances, it there are many, many hurdles that teachers face that stop them from being that way.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think you're very right. And I would name a few and say, I think that at least here in Colorado, which has always been a report card state, the fears of not getting the right grades, the right results on those tests. That the I think that's one of the sources of the fear, right? Like if I don't hold tight and make sure everything goes, as you said, the way I need it to, as opposed to the way it would organically, then how would I ever reach those goals, right? And if my job's in jeopardy, if I don't manage to do it, then sure, I'm going to hold on tight, right? Because it feels, I mean, it feels like that thing that would make me successful, perhaps because that's the way I was educated myself, because that's the way professional learning has been done in my life, right? And I agree with you completely. I think there's actually a really interesting element here which has to do with this idea of making sure that educators get professional learning in the same form that we would hope they would do it with kids,
Of
right?
course.
So even though a kindergarten teacher might tell me, oh, my kids are only 5, they can't possibly do this, the moment that that teacher has experienced participant centered learning where they're trusted, where they have voice, where they have agency. I'm about to go down to Austin and do some work with elementary schools in East Austin this week. And I'll be working with leaders and instructional coaches and some lead teachers. And that's exactly my goal. I want them to experience a flexible, participant centered classroom, because my hope would be then that they can start to see, oh, Jennifer trusted me, right? That means I can take risks. And I think your point about risks is really important to drill into too. I know that Alfie Kohn's
Mhm.
research has shown that when grades are attached to supposed success, when students know that there will be a grade given to the work that they're trying to do, their willingness to take risks
Oh,
goes down the
oh
toilet,
yeah.
right? And as a product of ungraded schools, I can safely say, I mean, obviously, when I got to college, I had to deal with grades. I had to figure out what the heck they even meant. But I am so grateful that that was the first time that I encountered grades, right? That somebody else was judging or assessing my work rather than me assessing, here are the things I think I did well. Here are the things I still need to work on in partnership with the educator, right? So that I did feel that willingness to take risks the next time, right? There's a lot here, right? There's a lot to what you're talking about and what I'm sharing. I do think that we need to shift the way we do professional learning. I think it's very hard for a teacher who has never experienced this themselves to trust kids. And I'm seeing it even in terms of how we design our learning spaces. My colleague and friend, Jill Akers, talks all the time about walking into classrooms and seeing instantly that the classroom is entirely owned by the teacher,
Oh yeah.
because 90% of that creativity, everything that's on the walls, was produced by the teacher, right? And even the messaging that's positive is still it still suggests to learners, if you're in my space, this is how we do things, as opposed to what you were describing as guidelines and what I was describing as agreements, right? Which are those things that we collaborate to reach, as opposed, and the walls should be filled with student work, and they should be deciding how to organize the furniture, right? um, that's what certainly what I work toward and what I try to help educators move toward.
It's interesting you say that. I'm going to um have you ever seen the cover of my book? You probably haven't.
I haven't. I'm so sorry.
No, nothing to be sorry about. So I'm going to put a picture of my book in this. So everybody, I'm going to put a picture in right in here. You'll see it. The picture of my book is the back wall of my room.
Mm,
It was done by students.
mm,
It took 4 students in one of my classes about 6 months to paint the back wall.
mm.
That's the cover of my book.
I love it.
And again, we're touching on stuff here, and we could just keep going and going. It's just so powerful. But I do want to kind of move on because of just time. So
Hmm.
it kind of leads into two topics that I want to kind of mention, and you can kind of bridge them together however you like. The first
Okay.
one is this inability to be open-minded,
Mm,
which I think you can go any way you want to go with that. And also one that I really am passionate about, and that is leaders doing the right thing for their staff and their students.
right.
How do we bridge those I mean difficult concepts of being open-minded, and that goes for anybody. You can go any way you want with it, and
Mm,
also from the leaders doing the right thing. And I will say before you answer, I am going to shout out my principal Joe Caracappa, who I have a lot of respect for. I really do. He's I'm just going to simply say he's a good man,
mm,
and he wants what's best for students and staff. So I think it's always important that when you are around a quality leader that you acknowledge and respect them for who they are. I think that's really critical because it's easy to not do that.
yeah.
It's easy
Yeah.
to say, "Oh my God, this person is horrible and this leadership is horrible," but we also need to make sure that we acknowledge the leaders that are really effective. So my two things are, how do we get over this idea of being open-minded, and how do we address leaders doing the right thing?
Oof, well, I think they're definitely connected.
Mhm.
And I think for me, I don't remember ever being encouraged to be closed-minded, certainly, right? I mean, I think I could say that my parents did a great job and my teachers did a great job, right, of encouraging me. I've done a lot of work around global education, and my first book was on that. And one of the things that I discovered was that even some of the most well-intentioned global educators we're still approaching other cultures with that same deficit mindset we were
Mhm.
talking about
Yep.
before, right? So rather than going into a new culture and thinking in an open minded way, I wonder what their gifts are. I wonder what their talents are. I wonder what they want to see improve in their communities. We were finding the people that I was working with in this field were finding that students were often coming away from immersive experiences and teachers as well saying, oh, I guess, I'm so lucky I have so much,
Right.
right?
Right.
Boy, am I grateful to have grown up where I am, those kinds of things. That's not what we're shooting for, right? I mean, I really believe that education should be grounded in a willingness to see others for who they are, to accept them for who they are. That includes learning to be critical of the choices that they make, but in a way that still honors who they are and the context that they're living in and growing up with. I think kindness goes with that too, right? I don't have to agree with somebody else. I don't have to necessarily, have a completely open mind to the way they see the world. I have to just be willing to accept that they see it differently than I do, right? And
Oof.
hear them and listen to them and appreciate their perspective, right? So I think it's connected to empathy. I think it's connected to all of those things. In terms of the leadership piece, one of the connection actually that I'm seeing right away, I've been interviewing leaders for the last year and a half for this new book, and the book is going to be, I hope, called "Taming the Turbulence in Educational Leadership: Doing Right by Learners Without Losing Your Job." I hope that will be the final title. We'll see what Corwin decides. But the what I've now interviewed 66 extraordinary leaders from all over the world who are doing exactly what we're talking about, right? They are facing, in many cases, extraordinary resistance whether that is from parents, from teachers themselves, occasionally from students, often on a political or governmental level, sometimes based on the requirements of the Ministry of Education, whatever it might be, right? They're facing a great deal of pushback against things that they know, based on the research, are things that learners need. And so I think some of this is about helping the community become more open-minded to something different, right? Now, I will say that when I was ahead of school, I'm going to be really honest here, Craig, and say I absolutely bit it when it came to truly leaning in with curiosity to understand why the parents were resisting something that I had been hired to do, right? I was hired to bring project-based learning and student-centered thinking to a fairly traditional school in a pretty traditional environment in Colombia. And what I think I did most of the time was argued with them to try to get them to agree with me. Um, and now, and I realized this through the interviews, right? Because so many of these leaders said, well, you have to lean in, you have to be authentically curious about why they're resisting. Understand where that's coming from. Remember that every parent is dropping their dreams at your doorstep every morning, and they fear for their kids' future, and they love their children dearly. And so anytime you're doing something that they're scared of, I mean, that's why they're scared, right? They're scared for their kids' well-being. They're scared that you're, if it's inclusion, that you're somehow trying to brainwash their children to think differently than they do, right? Whatever it might be. So what does it look like for a leader to lean in with curiosity and say, even though I don't agree with you, even though I do have an agenda that I want to promote and reach, I actually want to know what you think and why you think that way, right? Um, really tricky. I definitely tended much more often to argue and just try to bring them over to my side than to really understand them with an open mind. And so I think this goes in all directions. We want our parents to be open-minded. We want our local and state and national governments and educational organizations to be open-minded to the way we think. We probably need to do the same thing as well ourselves.
I love that. Here's an interesting thought. So another person I'm going to shout out, who I've had on my podcast. If you get a chance, I'll put the link in. Check out the podcast I did with Julia Skolnick. Everybody, it's if you're in education or you're in leadership, it's pretty powerful. So Julia is a brain scientist. She talks about brain and learning. And Julia, I hope you see this because I'm stealing your term. It's one of my favorite terms that you taught me, so I'm stealing it. And it's called TAP. And it ties into what you're saying, Jennifer. And I believe every educator and leader should be using this term in your classroom, in your school. It stands for trust, agency, and passion.
Love
Okay.
it.
And I'm going to tie it into what Jennifer said because I think it's critical. You nailed this, Jennifer, in such an authentic, positive way. So, as a leader of your school, you were talking about meeting with parents, and there was a lot of arguing, right? Well, because they didn't trust you.
Right. Right. Or they didn't trust what we were going toward, what we were moving toward. Right.
Exactly. So they either didn't trust you or they didn't trust the process, whatever it is. And if they don't trust the process or you, then you're not going to have agency for students because they don't trust it. And when you don't have agency, you don't have passion.
Right.
All three of them, and this kind of goes back to our initial thing of show me a teacher, a leader, and students who trust what's going on around them. They believe wholeheartedly, not perfectly, because nothing's ever perfect, but they believe wholeheartedly that the leader of that school trusts the staff, and the staff trusts the students trust the staff, which leads to trust from parents. When you have that trust, most of the time, of course, nothing is, again, all the time. I don't want to say that. But once you have that, Then you have something that was one of our initial parts of our conversation was a student-centered classroom. And that's
Right.
and that's agency.
Right.
In most schools that I have been associated with, most schools that I visited, most schools that I've talked to, there's a lack of agency
Right.
because everything is a top-down approach. Leader says this, teacher says this, student says this, and then it goes back to the parents. And they see this grade and they're okay, this is okay. And that is the process of that mouse wheel of education. When you do that, then you have no passion
Right.
because it's just the same thing regurgitated over and over and over again.
Mhm.
What you're talking about and if I'm wrong, you can just correct me. You're talking about schools where people trust each other,
Right.
where
Definitely.
they have agency to be willing to show who they truly are. And by doing that, they become passionate learners.
Yes. Absolutely. And if I can jump in,
Please.
I think that needs to be true at all levels, right? So I think that we rarely trust educators. um,
Hey.
I think we rarely trust leaders. I think we rarely trust students, right? And so, I've seen what happens when a teacher feels trusted. Their
Oh,
willingness to take risks, to try something a little different, to connect with the kids in a different way. I mean, it's incredible the kinds of things that they do. And I agree. I think that trust is a really, really central element. And I also agree that when people feel that they have voice, and again, I mean, you even said this, we do all of our professional learning with no choice in so many places. Occasionally we go to conferences and you got some choice, but even then you probably have a lot of choice between different speakers who are going to lecture at you for an hour, right? So it's tricky, right? To really have agency. Capono and I actually didn't use the term agency in the landscape model. We used the term protagonism. And
yep.
I would love to see this word really take off in reference to education. In Spanish, protagonismo is actually a really core concept, right? It's a word that's used a lot in education, but in the US, not in English, not so much, right? We use protagonist a lot, but
Mhm.
not very often
Right.
protagonism. But what it suggests is that every child feel like the Jason Bourne of their own action
Oh, I
movie,
love
right?
that.
Not an extra, and I'm actually stealing from Capono here. Not an extra in the movie put on by the teacher, but a true protagonist at the heart of their own journey, right? And what if every educator felt that way too? Right? That they actually had choices, that they didn't just have to stick to a narrow path that's been prescribed for them. Might that change their experience and even how much they trust kids? Because they would discover very quickly, oh, what do you know? They're capable of thinking and behaving for themselves, right? Of managing their own process. So I agree with you completely. And I think that passion, I've seen it. I've seen teachers take years to get there, but I've definitely seen teachers, when trusted and given that agency to experiment, who get excited about teaching again. I've also had a few teachers, at the school in Colombia, we did a lot of work around passion and purpose, in
Yep.
particular purpose. And one of the perhaps accidental results was that I lost a few teachers,
Mhm.
right? In particular, I'm remembering an art teacher, really wonderful art teacher, who approached me at the end of my first semester at the school and said, Jennifer, I'm going back to my art. This is not my purpose. This is not my passion. And I had to, celebrate her choice and her decision and her realization this is not what she wanted to do with her life, right? Um, but I'd love to see more of that trust. I'd love to see kids, and I think any educator can actually imagine what this looks like, right? When you walk into a classroom where there is trust, agency, and passion, it's not clean and quiet, right? It's dynamic. It's maybe even a little loud sometimes. It's like that lightly controlled chaos where everybody's excited about what they're doing. I would love to imagine being able to create that for every kid on the planet.
I think this is going to go back to kind of our initial thing, and this is for the educators that are watching, and I hope that the message I'm going to give you resonates with you. because I'm thinking about it, um, of the teacher that I am, the kind of things I do. It's not bragging. It's just I think about
Mhm.
being a certain kind of teacher.
Sure.
Um, when you walk in your room, are kids happy to see you?
Right.
Like, take a deep second and think about that. When you walk in your room, are students, no matter what their grade, are they happy to see you, or are they dreading your class?
Yeah.
And I'll simply say that because the number of hands I shake each day is in the hundreds.
Right.
I'm shaking hands with hundreds of students each day. It's just something that I've done with kids for years. And it's a connection where the kids know that it's a sign of mutual respect. And I'm not suggesting that is what you should do because that's not for me to say. But
Right.
what I am saying is all of the stuff that Jennifer's talking about, what she just talked about, that passion. When you walk in your room the day after you watch this podcast, I'd like you to think about what's the facial expression when you walk in the room of what's the facial expression from kids. And I'm not saying every kid, to be fair, I teach high
Sure.
school, teach kids at 7:30 in the morning. I have seen plenty of that. Now, I myself am not like that, but I've seen plenty of that. And I don't take that personally because the kids are just tired. Got it. But in general, how many students are saying good morning to you? How many students are saying have a good day? How many students are saying thank you?
Yeah.
If they're doing that, you have covered so you've covered so many parts of
Mhm.
being a positive, inspiring educator, which leads to the things that Jennifer was talking about. This idea of having a classroom that is student centered because kids know they can trust you. At
Absolutely.
least that's my take on it.
I love that. And I've, for years and years, I've used this quotation in a lot of my workshops, and it comes from Milton Chen, who used to work for the Sesame Street workshop folks and is the leader or leader emeritus, maybe, of the George Lucas Foundation and Edutopia and all of that now. What Milton Chen says is that you can judge the quality of a classroom by whether students run faster to get into it or out of it.
Yes.
And it's exactly what you're talking about, right? And
Yes.
I'll often pose that to teachers and I'll say, stand in the hall and notice, right? Notice, pay attention. I used to do it in the parking lot. And aside from those kids who were arriving at school late and who were running for another reason, I could
Right.
tell by whether they ran or dawdled, whether they actually wanted to be at school and in class. And I could tell by their emergence to the buses as well, the very same thing, right? So I think that's it's a way of, I guess, measuring, I guess, what you're talking about, right? I love the shaking hands is another way to measure that. But it's so easy to stand in your doorway and notice, are kids running or are they, dragging their feet to come in? And are they running or dragging their feet to go out? Because what we really want to see are kids who never want to leave that classroom because they love it so much to be in your space and to engage with you there, right? That's what we're really shooting for.
Yeah. How about we're getting close to wrapping up. I want to ask you a couple questions. Okay. Can you
Sure.
tell me something that you're most proud of? And it can be anything you like. It could be personal,
Mm.
professional, whatever you like.
For me, personal and professional meld so much, but I am very, very proud of my writing. And I mentioned this earlier. I spent a lot of years training, trying to become the best writer that I could. And I was first inspired to go into writing by a teacher from the Bronx who was leading a wilderness trip here in Colorado. It's a fascinating experience, even learning with him, because he was this Irish Catholic from the Bronx, and I'd never met anybody quite like him. And I remember we were hiking. It was a hard day. We had stopped for lunch, and he started reciting a William Butler Yeats poem. And it moved me, and it made me realize that words could move people. And so I am deeply proud of the chapter that I wrote for Barbara Bray's new book, of the writing. When people come up to me and say, "Oh, you moved me," or "You inspired me," that's what I'm going for, right? So that's definitely something that I'm deeply, deeply proud of.
Do
That
you,
and being bilingual in Spanish is another one, but this is the more meaningful one.
my wife is bilingual too.
Oh, nice.
Do you have any? Do you have your books with you or no?
I have a couple of them handy,
Can you put
yes.
them up?
So, one of them actually I don't have in my hands, but you can see the picture on the wall
I
there.
see it. Yeah.
That's the Global Education Guidebook. That was the first book that I wrote. It came out in 2017, and it's a very practical guide to building equitable partnerships for the classroom. Equitable in the sense of not falling into those deficit mindsets, not assuming that we're going to save others when we connect with them, but that we're going to learn from and with, right? This is the second book. This is the
Oh, I
landscape
love it.
model of learning.
I love it.
We were able to get Ron Berger from the Expeditionary Learning Network of Schools to write our foreword. And it's all about, it's the landscape model of learning, designing student-centered experiences for cognitive and cultural inclusion. I have to say, I do agree with you about the student-centered thing. I think it's gotten very overused without deep intention behind it. We definitely use it with deep intention.
Awesome.
And the new one I can't show you because I don't have it in my hands yet. August 2025 is what we're shooting for.
Nice. I'm super proud of you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
now, tell me something that has been the most challenging for you.
In general, huh?
Yeah, whatever. You decide.
What's been the most challenging for me? Oh, shifting from working with young people to working with adults. Being super honest here, right?
Yeah.
And I say this as, nobody in my life understands, except for the other high school teachers like you. Nobody understands why I enjoy hanging out with teenagers all the time. But I love hanging out with teenagers. And you put me into a group of teenagers today, and I am going to be in absolute heaven. I maybe I guess I assume when they make mistakes, when they get stubborn, when they get stuck, that it's because they don't have more experience yet, right?
Yes.
Like I give them a certain benefit of the doubt. They're only 15, they're only 16, right? Like they haven't had all the I don't give adults that same benefit of the doubt. I feel like they should know better.
Oh,
Do you know what I
I
mean?
disagree. Oh,
Really?
yes. I think
So I struggled with it.
I'll let you finish, but I'll tell you. I'll just very briefly say that what I really believe is I don't assume anybody knows anything,
Mm,
because when you do that, there's that you make an ass out of you and me, whatever.
right,
But I really believe, and I try to practice this all the time, is that what I might know, what I might understand, doesn't mean you do, and what
right,
you know and
right.
you understand doesn't mean I do. And I'll say this:
Sure.
this is a thing for teachers, and then I'll let Jennifer finish. Is when a teacher says to me, they should know that, I call bull.
Right,
Why? According to who?
right.
You?
Yeah.
I mean, according to you, they should know it. Well, maybe they didn't grow up in that culture. Maybe they weren't taught that. That's like the handshake. When I
Right.
shake hands with kids, I tell kids, look at me when I shake your hand.
Yeah.
After I say it once, they do it.
Right.
Initially, they didn't know it.
Yeah.
So go back to your. I'm sorry. Go back to your challenging thing. I'm sorry for cutting you off.
No, I don't disagree with you actually. I would agree completely. I think that we're all at a certain place in our learning and our growth, and we can't determine for others. 100%. I just struggled with the shift, right? Because I think maybe on certain levels adults become more ingrained in certain behaviors or habits or
Yes.
mentalities too.
Yes.
It's harder to sort of jiggle us out of our mindset, myself included. That's why I argued with parents so much, right? So I think it's a very different scenario to work with adults. And when I say I feel like they should know better, it's not that I think they should know how to do something. that I'm there to teach them, because that's my role. I'm there to teach them that. It's more like I feel like they should know better in terms of their willingness to lean in and try, in terms of their willingness to grow, in terms of their willingness to attempt something that's different from what they've done before. And I've found it much harder to move adults forward in their growth than it is to move a teenager forward.
Well,
So that's kind of what I mean.
you know what, Jennifer? Hopefully, we can do a part two. Um,
I'd
I,
love that.
I'll say something to that. So I'm a wellness coach.
Hmm.
My thing is fitness. That's my thing. I'm very heavily involved in wellness, and one of the things I've learned is that um, it's very easy to say people know that they shouldn't eat donuts, right?
Right.
They know that they should move,
Hmm.
right? They know they should get enough rest, and they know they should have a positive attitude, right? They know that,
Right.
but many people don't do it, even though they know it, because you're talking about habits.
Yeah.
You know, habits are.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole nother podcast, but habits are
Right.
they're difficult. Um, okay, two other questions. What now that we're wrapping up? Tell the audience what you hope they gain from our time together.
Mm. Oh, that's a great question. Um, I hope, I think the most important thing from my perspective would be that folks walk away really willing to try to see students as whole human beings. Um, you know, how they do on the test isn't all of who they are. How good they are at school isn't all of
Oh,
who they are, right? And I hope that all teachers would go into the classroom tomorrow, and try to understand what their kids care about, what their learners are good at. um, it connects to some degree to that idea of the zone of proximal development too, right? Like,
hmm.
what's that next right step for them? But it has to come from that place of really seeing them, and I think that that's a big piece of what creates trust. So I really hope that teachers might be, that listeners might tomorrow, even if you're parents too, right? What does it look like to after you've heard this podcast, to approach your kids with a little bit more of a questioning mentality and a trusting mentality, to see what comes from them, as opposed to being the one who makes the decisions for them.
You
Hope that
love.
made sense. That was a little long, but
No, it was great. Um, so everybody, I'm going to have Jennifer come up with a closing message.
Mm,
Um, give her a few seconds to think about what she'd like to say. Uh, so everybody, uh, awesome conversation with Jennifer Klein. So many nuggets. There's a lot of nuggets to unpack here, and I really hope that obviously, if you watched and listened to both of us, you got something out of it. If you've watched some of my podcasts or some of the stuff I've done, I've always said there's three core tenets that I always think about as a podcast host. Is did you get something positive of the time you spent listening and watching? That's number one. Do you have a question that you still have that you'd like to ask? And that's number two. And number three, was it an experience that you felt had value? And obviously, Jennifer and I can't answer that, but those are the things that I always think about. Um, if you'd like to be on the podcast, please reach out to me. All my contact information will be at the end, as well as all of Jennifer's contact information, how to get her books, how to get in touch with her. I will all have that at the end of the podcast. So you kind of have to watch the podcast. um, Jennifer, you got a closing message?
I do. I do. You know, there's a fairly famous, well, short videos. I think he's mentioned it in a few places. Sir Ken Robinson, spoke many times on this idea of teachers and educators in general seeing ourselves as gardeners. And that's part of why Capono and I grounded the landscape model in natural metaphors. The idea is that a gardener knows that you can't force the growth of plants, right? And you can't stick the petals on, as he puts it in one of his talks. You have to create the environment, the conditions for growth. And any gardener knows that, even if all you've ever gardened are houseplants, right? If the conditions aren't right, too bad. It's not going to survive or thrive. The same thing is true in the classroom. And one of the quotations that Capono and I absolutely adore that we included was, when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. So I think the most important piece of all of this is we can't blame students. We can't say that kid didn't work hard enough. That kid doesn't have the skills, that whatever it might be, we cannot blame the kids. What we need to be doing is thinking about whether we have cultivated the kind of environment that will bring out the best in them. And I believe strongly that that is possible everywhere, that it is important to try to do everywhere, and that's our goal as educators, not to have perfect kids in perfect rows trying to be perfect, but simply to create those conditions that will allow them to grow in leaps and bounds and be their true selves.
Oh, I love that. Such a positive message. Jennifer, hang tight for a sec if you don't mind, please.
You got it.
Thank you so much for being with us on Cutting the Crap with Shap. Everybody, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your willingness to support the channel. If you get a chance, please subscribe, like, share. That's how the channel grows. And as I always say at the end of the podcast, you are awesome.